Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second episode of my podcast. Today we will be talking about the Middle Ages. A lot of people think that the Middle Ages were a time where nothing happened in Europe except for knights bashing each other's heads in. But today's guest will tell you that they are wrong, because some people did manage to paint things. Our guest today is Isabel, Cambridge's #1 art historian specializing in medieval Czech art, and a very good friend of mine. She's about to complete her bachelor's degree in art history and has taken the time out of her busy schedule to talk to us about it. Isabel, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for inviting me, Darius. Really happy to be here.
I'm very happy to have you. So I want to begin by asking, what actually got you interested in this topic of medieval Bohemian art?
When I first started my art history degree, I was quite interested in more later periods, so contemporary art. But then the more I started to study the earlier periods, like Renaissance and medieval times, I got more and more interested in it. And particularly sort of the era of the 1300s, so 14th century. One course that I completed last year really inspired me to pursue this topic further, in particularly the global connections, or this idea of global medieval art. So I did a course last year on early Renaissance art from a global perspective, and that introduced me to lots of interesting ideas about cross-cultural connections with Europe, sort of beyond the canon. So what I would usually be used to would be, as many others, I guess, Italian artworks from those big names like, for the later Renaissance, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and earlier perhaps Giotto and those types of figures. But having the opportunity to explore sort of lesser known artists and artists that perhaps were involved in travel as well and exchanged goods through diplomatic relations, or even just spolia from war that was transferred to different countries. I find that intersectionality really fascinating.
Well, that certainly does sound fascinating. Now, the area where you focus on was a crossroads of sorts at the time, medieval Bohemia, but many listeners may not be familiar with this area. Could you describe for us, where is this place? What does it look like at the time? What is the politics of it? And what makes it unique and connected as well?
Yes, for sure. So this is quite an interesting region, particularly because even in recent history in the 20th century, it's gone through a lot of change with borders. So what we know today to be the Czech Republic was also once Czechoslovakia, and then before that was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, part of that. So it has quite a complex history. But if we're going to the particular period that I'm interested in, which is the 14th century, or the height of the 14th century, with the introduction of Charles IV as the Holy Roman Emperor of that region and also the King of Bohemia, then if we look at the borders, when the king was elected in 1346, he was succeeding his father as the King of Bohemia, and as a result he created what came to be known as the Bohemian Crown lands, on the foundation of the original Czech lands ruled by what was known as the Přemysl dynasty up until the 1306. And so he united these regions with other provinces, and so Bohemia was bordered in the south by the upper and lower Austria, and also in the west by Bavaria, which is now in Germany, and in the north by Saxony and Lusatia, the former in modern-day Germany and the latter now in Poland, as well as in the northeast by Silesia, which is now in Poland, and in the east by Moravia. And even today, Moravia and Bohemia now compose one country, which is known as Czechia, or the Czech Republic.
All right. Yeah, I think that gives us a really good geographic primer on sort of where we are. Now, you mentioned Charles IV, of course, one of the most important characters in this story. He started, as I understand it, in many ways, the whole Bohemian art scene. But before him, was there anything going on that set the preconditions for that explosion? Or was it very much a he arrives and then art happens sort of thing?
Well, I would say that the period of Charles IV is one of the most, well-known periods of art history, because he really did leave quite a big, or like a large legacy, I would say, on the country, particularly even when you visit Prague today, seeing sites like Charles Bridge or even Charles University, you see his name almost everywhere. And so I would say that there was really a key shift in the political climate and social climate at the time when he did come to the throne. At this point in the mid 14th century, when the Czech peoples, are, as I'm going to call them, obviously these terms are quite hard to use in this particular period because the word sort of Czech has its own sort of associations, but for the sake of simplicity, I'll just call it the Czech peoples, under one Holy Roman Emperor and King, it gives the land the opportunity to develop what some may call today as a distinctly Bohemian style. And so that art was supposed to be representative of the empire. Now, what's important to remember here is that Charles IV's background is already quite cross-cultural. And so from his mother's side, he was a member of the Bohemian house of the Přemysl dynasty that was more prominent before it was all centralized under the Holy Roman Empire. But from his father's side, he was a member of the House of Luxembourg. And so he even chose the name Charles at his confirmation in honor of his uncle, Charles IV of France, at whose court he resided for 7 years. And he received a French education and was literate and fluent in, obviously, French, Latin, German, Italian, and Czech. And then also in 1331, he spent time in Italy with his father, and even around in 1333 founded the fortress and town of Monte Carlo, which can translate to Charles's Mountain. So you can already see that he's got these sort of relations in multiple European, what we would call today, countries or regions. And so this in turn would allow him to create a style of art that would be able to compete with the other great powers of the time, and a style that, although it took from many different cultures, this unique combination or synthesis would allow for the Bohemian kingdom to have a place on the wider European scale of interest.
So we have this court now in Bohemia with this very intelligent king who has a lot of talents, speaks all the languages you could ever want. And then, however, I assume he did not paint and build all the things himself. So who did he get to do it for him? Where did they come from? And why did they come to him in Bohemia?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so he had multiple court painters. One of the most famous ones, or known as now the most beloved court painter of his, is called Master Theodoric. And he was identified with what people know as the post-Giotto generation of painters. And so his style introduced what has been known as the sense of plasticity and scope of forms. And at the same time, his pieces include what's been described as the documentary realism of Franco-Flemish painting, with a particular emphasis on the Parisian painting of the mid-14th century. And so it was a fusion of these two aesthetics, which allowed this unique synthesis that we just introduced with Charles's cross-cultural background. His most famous work is probably the Chapel of the Holy Cross at Charles's castle near Prague, which contains slightly over life-size portraits of saints and other figures on gold ground. And so he most likely came to Prague from the Rhineland, the workshop of an artist perhaps called William of Cologne, but it's not really for certain if that was really where he came from, but it has been theorized that that was the case. And following a study trip to northern Italy in the 1350s, he would have started to work in Charles's court. And so one academic called Bojmanováši states that in about 1309, a sculptor also was described as Magister Theodoricus de Alemannia, so it could have been an ancestor of his. And also his brother, the painter Giletto, was active at the court of Charles II of Anjou in Naples. So once again, we can see that he did have quite an interesting background that wasn't necessarily, he just was born in Bohemia, grew up there, but these sorts of artists would have had training in the works of many different states and many different styles, particularly what's now known today as Germany or Italy.
Do we know of what made these artists move to any specific place? Were they part of a retinue of, let's say, a person like Charles IV, or were they sort of freelancers that would go wherever there would be commissions. I assume there were also other artists, such as like I read of French architects. What made them come to Bohemia? Were they invited? Did they go on their own? I would be interested to hear about that.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I mean, that's an area of research that I'm also very interested in, like this idea of the idea that artists weren't really necessarily linked to just one land, but that the boundaries were more permeable. So I think that it sort of depends on the case. There's not really a hard and fast rule for everyone, but I would say there were definitely people who were invited to courts, but it could also have been the case that people would just pragmatically go to other places to have work. So it's known, I mean, even down into the high Renaissance times, you get examples of more famous Italian artists going to work in perhaps other parts of it, other nation states within, or sorry, not nation states, before nation states, but other regions within Italy, or further afield. So it's definitely the case that there were various reasons why people would move. So either it would be for employment opportunities, or if this person was known on a wider scale as being a very skilled artist, or their workshop in particular, because you have to remember that at this time, artists worked in workshops with many different apprentices often. That's why it's sometimes quite difficult to attribute artwork to certain masters, because it could be that they were imitating the hand of their master, but they were merely an apprentice of theirs. So that's also the case with Master Theodoric. You often get academics, also because it's not really been researched as much in depth as, for example, Italian workshops, but often people sort of tend to revert to saying, okay, if this is in the style of Master Theodoric, then it must be by his hand, but that's not necessarily the case most of the time.
That's really fascinating. It quite destroys the myth of the lone genius who creates these things. It seems like sort of a corporate almost enterprise to have this group of apprentices doing the master's work in a way for him or with him. And yeah, that is quite interesting. So Theodoric himself, was he one of the really famous ones that would have been invited there, or was he sort of more of the let's move where we can get employment?
I'm not really sure if it's very clearly documented, but I would assume that he did rise to fame. And so he would have, even if he wasn't necessarily invited by Charles IV at first, he would have been, I guess, because he was so beloved by Charles IV, his reputation would have grown with his support. And so he could have been commissioned to complete other works throughout the country with people who would have had the money to commission that sort of high level of work, or at the very least, other artists would imitate his work. So, for example, there's an interesting link with a manuscript in the monastery that I'm researching at the moment in a town called Reihrad, which is quite near Brno in what's now known as Moravia. And academics have theorized that Master Theodoric did some of the illuminations in this particular manuscript, but it's sort of a matter of controversy, because you have to wonder if that monastery would have had the funds to commission somebody as prestigious as that to complete this sort of work, or if he would have decided himself personally that he would do that. It seems much more likely, at least to me, that perhaps a member of his workshop or another artist that was also perhaps quite well respected at the time did imitate his style. And then the question arises about, so was this style unique to him, or could we sort of extrapolate and say that this style actually was more of a symptom of a wider movement within the Czech lands at that time, or a wider stylistic impulse? So it really depends on how you, I guess that becomes a historiographical issue, or issue of how you tell art history, really.
That is fascinating, because you say it might have been another respected artist who would make this sort of imitation. So it wasn't like a sort of industry of fakes going around where people were, trying to make themselves look richer by saying they have an original Theodoric. Was it acceptable, or there was no copyright, I assume, Was there sort of rivalry among artists about their original works, or because that is quite fascinating?
Yeah, I mean, you ask a really interesting question. I think that really leads us to, we have to sort of adjust the way that we view artists in this time. Because, I mean, myself included, the way that I would view it at first is through a contemporary lens of artists, that sort of like this idea of the cult of the artist, that the artist is this amazing, famous individual, that having a work of theirs is very coveted, and anything that would imitate their art would be seen as fraudulent and just, you know, not really well respected, because one style becomes their own property in a sense, at least in the 20th century, maybe even earlier. Perhaps with the workshops of Rubens, that's when you start to see, I guess, the branding of artwork more, perhaps with a unique style. But I would say at this time, we have to think about the motivations of these artists. So the reasons why they would be commissioned would often be for religious commissions. And so the idea of having style was sort of a means to an end. So having a style that would perhaps imitate Italian artworks that they perhaps saw on pilgrimage, or Theodoric when he was training in Italy, visiting these famous works in churches or cathedrals, they would have been influenced by that in order to transfer that sense of spirituality to their works. So it wasn't necessarily to create work that was aesthetically pleasing or that was something that somebody wanted to own, but it was for the service of the church and the wider devotional aspect to these pieces. So whether that be in the context of a chapel of a ruler or a well-known nobleman, or, you know, in churches within a monastery, it would have not really been seen in the same way as what we view as sort of a stylistic brand these days, because the goal was not, at least it shouldn't have been, to promote yourself, but it was really using the gifts that you had to serve God.
Yeah, that is fundamentally different from the way that modern art, or even art like, just in later eras, in the late Renaissance and so on, I guess started to work. So does that mean that if someone were to commission such a piece, what was their intention with it? So you put it in your chapel in order to make that chapel, I assume there is a status element to it in the end, right?
Oh, yes.
But was it also was there like a hope that perhaps you could gain some sort of spiritual salvation through the commissioning of especially fine artwork?
So there's a really interesting idea of what is known by this Latin word memoria. So the way that people would have also used these devotional pieces or altar pieces is often more wealthy patrons would donate money intentionally to certain monasteries, or feature themselves within an altar piece, perhaps kneeling before the cross of Christ or kneeling next to some other saints. And so that would be sort of, a portrait of them by the artist within that scene. So placing themselves within the artwork, or at least as major donors to that particular institution, would have maybe, it would have made them more prominent within the wider imagination or devotional practice of the people there. So if you put your name on a plaque in a prominent place in a monastery, then people are going to notice your name, and people are going to be prompted to pray for you. For example, I mean, as we see, the main prominent tradition here is Catholicism. So praying for you in purgatory, or praying for you to have a noble death and salvation beyond the grave. So people strategically made their name or their portraits prominent within these pieces in order for people to motivate people or to remind people to pray for them.
That is really interesting, because it diverges so radically from later traditions of like portraiture, where it's just the guy on his horse, and it's a very different character, of course, than smuggling yourself, so to speak, into a religious image that people will pray to. This is perhaps a bit of a tangent, but I am now very much intrigued by it. What made the shift eventually happen from, like, if you wanted to have yourself painted, putting yourself into a religious scene, to standalone portraits, like, and speaking in the wider sense of like art history?
I mean, that's such an interesting question. I could probably talk about that for hours. But like
Okay,
for
then
this,
perhaps we'll just make it a brief one.
yeah, for the sake of being brief, I would say it really ties into this idea of self-fashioning that emerges in the Renaissance or in the High Renaissance. So people start to present themselves in a way that they want to be viewed with a certain like social intention in mind. So, for example, I mean, the most prominent example I can think of at the moment is Rubens.
Mhm.
So, Peter Paul Rubens, he never depicted himself in any self-portraits with a paintbrush or as an artist, because he didn't want himself to be viewed in that way. He wanted himself to be viewed as a noble member of society at the time. So he would depict himself perhaps with his first wife seated in very fashionable clothing. I'm thinking of the painting The Honeysuckle Bower at the moment, with a sword, you know. So the way that people presented themselves in turn would affect the kind of commissions that they would get, particularly artists. So if he saw himself or presented himself as an upstanding, respected member of society, and then he could bring himself into those noble circles or elite circles where he would be able to get those commissions. Or sometimes artists would kind of show off with the way that they had these mythological learned references in their paintings to make them seem, you know, very educated. And so you definitely want to commission me for your next piece because I'm so learned. So I think it very much ties into this idea of self-fashioning. So as the artist becomes more independent from church commissions, then they have to form their own identity for themselves, almost separate from that as well, or as closely linked as they would like. But there emerges this sort of new sense of self in a way. And of course, you know, Rubens had his own great workshop as well, with many apprentices and people working there. But often he would sign his pieces, you know, by the hand of Rubens, or supervised by the hand of Rubens would kind of be something that he would promote. So even though often he would choose the pieces actually, so he would choose elements of pieces that he liked to paint and then leave the other parts for his apprentices. So
I can imagine,
the faces, and then he would leave the landscape for somebody else, or he would collaborate with other artists for them to complete the more natural aspects, so landscapes or animals for that. Yeah, but ultimately I would say that it really is something to do with this new emergence of a sense of self and having to assert that independently of church authority.
Mm-hmm. So to bring it back then to the Middle Ages, before there was the cult of the artist and the branding, how did they become famous? Because I assume an artist would still want their work to be seen more and get more commissions. So in an era before that sort of publicity, how would an artist go about trying to become one of the big names? Would it be like recommended by different churches who had pieces made by them, or you tell me?
Yeah, I mean, it could definitely be that. So churches, I imagine, would have had communication between themselves, or also, I guess, some artists were even like members of confraternities or, you know, monasteries themselves. So like, for example, Fra Angelico is like one of the most famous Italian examples I can think of. Or there would also be different guilds of artists that would emerge. So that would, people who knew each other in the guild, you know, would have this sort of like camaraderie where they would be able to sort of tell other people, I suppose, about different commissions that were available or recommend their friends to other people. So there were still these sort of societal groups that existed that would have allowed for these connections to be made.
Yeah, that does sound... I've also studied guilds to some extent in my own historical work, and yeah, it does sound very much like these tight-knit communities that are very much exclusionary in a way, which is perhaps very different from later artists who would be individual businessmen, not necessarily part of these guild structures. And so that is pretty interesting. Now, we've already touched on this a bit, but to go to the next topic, what subjects were like preferred and why in these religious painting contexts? One of the very prominent ones that you studied, of course, being the Death of the Virgin. But let's start with the more general and then focus in on that.
Okay, so generally in this period, it's before the Reformation of Jan Hus, just before it. So we can see that most imagery would be Catholic, or like what you would imagine to be sort of like your stereotypical, I guess, pictures of saints, pictures of also pieces. For example, I mean, there was a particular emphasis of the veneration of the Virgin Mary, and the fact that she, according to Catholic tradition, assumed to heaven, there's no bodily relics of her. So they sort of had to compensate for that to some extent. So having there's sort of like also an increased emphasis on garments and maybe like different sort of tactility of that if you can't have the tactility of bodily relics themselves. But I suppose what's unique about the Bohemian interpretation or this region's interpretation is the particular, what I see more and more in my research emerging, is this emphasis on Byzantine forms. So particularly with the Dormition of the Virgin, that's a very well-known Byzantine iconography. And we don't really see this type of iconography in more Western European examples very often. I mean, there's like Domenico Veneziano's Dormition of the Virgin, but it's apart from this, like there's very few Italian examples of that. And so that made me question why that is and how it sort of came into this part of Central Europe but didn't really transfer to other parts as much. And I think that's to do with the deeper history of the emergence of the sort of literacy within the Bible in this era. So the most famous missionaries to the Czech Republic are still known today as Cyril and Methodius. And Cyril was a Byzantine monk, and he developed the Glagolitic script. And so that was sort of like the first time that biblical text could be transferred to that region in a way that was more accessible. And so I wonder whether perhaps including scenes like the Dormition in popular visual culture, it would have been a visual cue to viewers to this Byzantine past. And I mean, we see in Italy, for example, in places like Venice that don't have a antique past, they try to fabricate an antique past with, for example, their colonies or with any other relations. So Venice uses a combination of ancient Rome and Byzantium, whereas in Bohemia we see this increased emphasis on particularly Byzantium, and I believe it's because of this particular link to Cyril.
Is this the Cyril of the Cyrillic alphabet as well? Or is that
Yes.
a different Cyril? Oh, that's the same guy.
Yes, I think so, yes.
All right, well, he's very, very important, of course, in world history. So sort of the thoughts that come to me in this context is, how would these Bohemian artists, which of course are pretty far away from Greece and the sort of Greek Orthodox world in some ways, although in some ways also quite close, how would they come to have access to images that they could use for inspiration? Did any of them travel to Greece? Did Cyril bring with him some little paintings to show off? Or how do you think that travel occurred? Or the translation of imagery from one cultural space to another?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is really an intriguing question. I think that it really depends on whether we look at it from them receiving this sort of imagery from a first-hand point of view or from a second-hand point of view. So I think so far the popular idea in scholarship, when it's mainly been compared to more important Italian examples, is that okay, they've been inspired by these Italians who've been inspired by Byzantium, hence their main influence is Italian. But actually that might not be the case, because they could have had links to the original Byzantine icons as well, or could have acquired them themselves on an independent basis. For example, I mean, it becomes even more interesting when we think about the wider agenda of using particularly Benedictine monasteries to reintroduce Slavonic liturgy, which often made use of connections to missionaries and monasteries, for instance, in the Balkans. And it's been theorized that icons that were in those monasteries were transferred to monasteries in what's now Czechia via particular routes. So for example, I mean, in my own work, I'm looking at the Reihrad monastery, and I found out that they would have had a Madonna and Child icon in one of the private chapels there. And so it could be very plausible that this came from those sorts of links.
Wow, so it's not simply a second-hand Italian sort of takeover, but the direct, also in part like translation, maybe that might be the right word, of Greek, or I guess Byzantine artistic styles.
Yeah, I mean, there hasn't been much work done on
the cutting-edge research that you get on this podcast. That's why you listen.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is really cool. But was there any evidence of anyone actually going to Byzantium to also see any of this? Or I guess the glory days of the Byzantine Empire were past at this point, with the Fourth Crusade having already happened. Like, is there travel between that, like, of actual people as well, or only of the objects? Or is there not even any evidence of that?
Yeah, so there were definitely pilgrims who visited sites in Italy and also perhaps beyond. I mean, if we think about also Venice as a port city known for its pilgrimage sites and also known as a place where you would go to get on a ship or a boat to get to the next pilgrimage site. So they were very ahead of their time with their travel tourism, and so it could be that, I mean, there is evidence of Czech pilgrims going to the Holy Land via Venice, I would say, very likely. And so there were definitely also the movements of individuals. It's quite hard to trace, case by case basis, how did each icon get there? I think there's multiple answers for that. So, for example, I've mentioned before with the missionary and monastery transfers between different monks or individuals within those orders. But then also it could be that people sort of acquired them from other relations that they had in Italy. So it wouldn't necessarily have to be that they brought these icons back from the place where they were originally made, because since it's such a long history of conflict in the Middle Ages and diplomacy, you never know how art could have been, how it exchanged hands. But we do have theories, so we can work from those.
I have a sort of more basic question which is related to this. Byzantine icon and the sort of Catholic painting of a saint, are those like sort of interchangeable, or do they have a different function? What makes an icon as such, and what makes what Theodoric and his contemporaries would have been painting different, particularly in their function?
Yes, that's such an interesting question. So I would say that we have to go back to this idea of what the Renaissance was and how that sort of, I guess, manifested itself in different ways throughout Europe. So one of the most, if not the most important examples of the spearheads of the Renaissance is Giotto, with, for example, his Scrovegni Chapel. And the reason why he's used as such an important example for the development of the Renaissance is because he starts to move towards this way of depicting form that's a lot more emotional. Like if you see those pictures of the angels screaming in agony, Jesus' death, the Pietà scene there in the chapel, Scrovegni Chapel, you can tell that there is sort of like this increased emphasis on the emotive quality of art as a devotional object. And I think we see this transferred also into the Bohemian style. With regards to its relationship with icons, icons are known as being a lot less emotional. So they're known as being sort of these quite static portraits, usually of the Madonna. So these portraits, usually nothing much is happening. It's just sort of like a still image. And I mean, to learn more about the movement from icon to Renaissance paintings, I would say a great book for that is Hans Belting's title. I think it's called Image and Presence. I'll double check, but definitely Hans Belting's work in particular. He's a German art historian of the medieval era. He really charts this idea of moving from these more rigid forms into the more sort of fluid, emotional, passionate depictions of the Renaissance era or the High Middle Ages.
Okay. Do you think there's any myths sort of in the popular culture about medieval art that you think ought to be debunked? That's always fun to see an expert take down the misapprehensions people might have.
Oh yes, definitely. I mean, I've definitely fallen for these myths as well, I would say. So I think to start with, we have to think about the way that art history has been told over the years. And so one of the most famous first art historians who came from the Renaissance era is Giorgio Vasari with his Lives of the Artists. And he presents a particular narrative of art within that, where he champions the artists of the Renaissance, but he also really doesn't like the art that preceded that. And he sort of takes this organic view of development. So art gets better and better with time, and it's a linear development. Or actually, he does go further to say it's sort of like a cyclical development, that he actually has a really quite an interesting famous quote from his book where I'm paraphrasing, but he says something like, art is born, then it grows old, and then it dies. And then you have this like process of regeneration. So he sort of takes this cyclical approach, which many people take issue with, myself included to a certain extent, because his books, I think, are really the origin of the idea that many people believe today, that medieval art is not really good art, or it's not really skillful art, because you don't really get that sense of perspective being very important in this time, or you don't really have those same developments that Renaissance brings to the table. And so it's always been sort of viewed as a counterpart or a foil to the Renaissance. But then again, there's also the issue of where did the Renaissance start? That's a whole other
Does it even exist?
thing that you could discuss as well. Many people have debated over that a lot. But I think that really this Vasarian notion of the Middle Ages as being a period of decline is something that has really affected, canonical art, historical scholarship, and even popular culture.
Popular culture as well. Like, there's so many people who on the internet make fun of medieval art for looking kind of goofy and sort of stiff. And of course, illuminated manuscripts have their little doodles in them, which are occasionally somewhat entertaining. A prominent example that's often brought up is that children in medieval art will often look like very small adults.
Oh, yes.
Could you speak to that a bit? Why is that?
I mean, that's an interesting question, because I don't know if I can
fair enough.
really answer. But I don't really know if anyone really has like a clear-cut answer to it, but I can think about it, I guess. I think that it really just depends on, I guess, the style that was emerging at that time. So, like, people weren't really perhaps interested in depicting babies, or like, maybe they wouldn't have had like models or times when they would have had like babies accessible for them to draw.
Like sitting still, do they? Also, perhaps, this is me spitballing, but perhaps it's that notions of childhood are very much, I think, in a way, a 19th century or invention. Like, childhood is a set, like, you're born, as soon as you can walk, you get you work, right?
Yeah, I guess so, yeah.
Is a child really different from an adult? I think in many ways at the time that would not have been obvious to people that, that would be a different category that deserves a separate representation. But I'd like for you to sort of defend medieval art here and tell us what you think are the best arguments to say that it isn't just people who are really bad at drawing, but that this is actually something that, ought to be valued and looked at as... Why do you think that it is not just... bad art opposed to the Renaissance where people suddenly figured out how to draw well?
So I think that really comes down to the question of what is the point of art in a way, like why do we create art and why did they create art in that period? And when we start to understand that, then we can more fully appreciate what they made. So if art is just a expression of your learned status or of your ability to render perspective. Actually, interestingly, on the topic of perspective, we have this perception in the modern day for some reason that, maybe because of the advent of photography, but that the point of perspective was to create an accurate viewpoint. But actually, that's not always the case. There's evidence that artists in the Renaissance actually used perspective for symbolic purposes. So, for example, the vanishing point would maybe end on the head of a saint on purpose to lead you to devotion, or perhaps you would use multiple vanishing points for those same purposes. So actually perspective was a tool that was manipulated as well. So I think it really comes down to linking this back to medieval art and the way that we perceive it, or how valuable it should be. We have to sort of suspend our disbelief in a way, and we have to kind of let go of our modern day perceptions of what art should be. And should the goal of art just be to create a scene that's, aesthetically pleasing, or a scene that is accurate to reality? Especially in the times that we live in today, artists aren't really making that much art that's supposed to look like reality or figurative art. And so you could almost look at medieval art as another facet of that, in a way, that creating this work was really oftentimes meant to stir people to devotion, and so to bring you to this sort of heavenly realm of reality, and often making perhaps a more realistic scene would help you imagine the pain maybe that Jesus felt on the cross and help you sympathize and think about carrying your own cross as he called people to do. But there was, I guess what I'm trying to say is that every skill that was used was not really just for skill's sake. It was always for a purpose. And often that purpose was to lead people into a deeper intimacy with God and a more fulfilling or purposeful spiritual life.
Mm-hmm. Could you say how that specifically manifests itself in the sort of art from this period, which to me seems to be very much this sort of two-dimensional, cramped affair? What is the intention behind that? What makes it so special?
Yeah, so I would say we also have to remember that in that time, they didn't have the internet, so they couldn't just I think these days we're almost like overexposed to art or to imagery. Like, that's why when we see these sort of medieval images in the church, we're not really that impressed because we've seen so many interesting things online. We've watched so many films that we're kind of almost like overloaded in our visual inventories. But at that time, it would have been a lot more rare to see artwork. And going to a site like a pilgrim site or a church that was very well known, you wouldn't have been able to see like a picture of it online before you went there. I mean, at the most, maybe a print, but that doesn't come until later with the advances in the printing press. So it would be quite exciting to go somewhere that you don't know what it will be like. All you've heard is just about how amazing it is, maybe from other pilgrims. And so imagine the feeling of going into a church, which is probably quite darkly lit, maybe just with candlelight, and these icons with their gold leaf framing just sort of like coming alive in that dim setting. Like, that must be such a special experience. We have to remember that it was also sort of, there is this experiential quality to the artwork. It's not just us viewing medieval pieces on a wall in a museum. I mean, often we see that now a lot today. But if we think about their original context, it makes them a lot more captivating.
I love your description there. It really does bring it to life. And of course, this is a completely different experience that I have never thought of it in that sense before. But of course, yeah, if you don't get to go to the movies and you don't get to watch YouTube all day, as I unfortunately do, seeing a stained glass window with all its wonderful manifestations of light that you just don't get in everyday life would have been just amazing. And also the spiritual significance would have really transformed that experience in a way that's almost inaccessible today. Because even if I went to Milan recently, and going to Duomo, it is magnificent, it is enormous, but I think it would be still, me going in there and taking photos is never going to, I don't think I'll ever be able to access how that would have felt for someone when it was built, to walk in there and sort of see, the full might of God on display in a sense, or the full might of the economic power of the city, perhaps, if you want to be a bit more cynical about it.
Well, I mean, I think the closest that I recently got to that was I got invited to go to this chapel service in a village in Cambridge, and I didn't anticipate that this was what was going to happen, but what they sometimes do, so it was an Epiphany service to celebrate the Epiphany in the Christian calendar, and it was quite interesting. So what they did was, I mean, it was quite a massive chapel, and so you've got lots of people inside, and then what they decided to do is, so they handed out candles to everyone, and my friend sort of like whispered to me like, oh, what does this mean, what are we going to do here? And so we have this sense of excitement, and then we realized that they were actually going to decide to turn off all of the lights in the whole chapel, which doesn't always happen. It's quite rare that they decide to do that. And then bit by bit, as people start to process in with the choir, with the most beautiful singing, they start to light the candles one by one. So they light the one on the first row, and then the person next to you eventually transfers their flame to your flame, and then you transfer to the next person. And then eventually what you get is just these dots of light in this darkness. And then you hear somebody reading from the book of John saying that Jesus is the light that came into the world. And the way that they designed the chapel also was there was this painting on the ceiling of Jesus, and when you would have this lighting of the candles, it would particularly highlight the golden leaf or paint on that particular part of the chapel. So you are in this dark room with just this image of Jesus sort of like emanating from the ceiling and all these dots of light around, which is quite a special experience, which you don't really get very often, like in in today's world. And afterwards I just thought to myself, okay, I feel like I understand a bit more now, at least partly what people would have felt like going to these sorts of pilgrimage sites, being part of these sorts of rituals.
Yeah, I think that is really cool that such experiences are still sort of, I guess, not lost fully to time, but also it's really interesting to recognize this because I think a lot of people find it very difficult to imagine why people would go on a pilgrimage and, isn't that boring? Why would you do all that? They must have been really stupid to believe all this stuff. But I think there must have been an element of showmanship to it, of these very deep, significant experiences that you couldn't just get otherwise. And so in that sense, that really, it gives a lot of value to this, and I think hopefully enlightens our listeners a bit to the significance of this art. It is not that they can't draw, it is that they have a very specific purpose in mind and are making the best art they can to fulfill that. So we're running a bit short on time. Could you, very briefly, if that is even possible, give us sort of the historiography of the subject that you've been studying? How have people been thinking about it since all this art was made?
So when it comes to Bohemian medieval art or Czech medieval art, it becomes quite complex because, especially with issues like when it comes to attribution, because, for example, with the painting that I'm looking at, it was first attributed to perhaps an imitator or person associated with the school of Master Theodorik, but then later it was changed to be in the catalogue as by an unknown Austrian or Moravian painter. So you have all of these terms flying about, like Austrian, Moravian, Bohemian, Czech. What does this mean? And so we have to remember that also there's sort of a darker side to this as well in the 20th century with the German occupation, and then also in the Nazi era, and then also communism with a Russian influence on Czechoslovakia. And so it was only when the Iron Curtain fell in 1989 that scholarship, in a sense, had perhaps an opportunity to be reborn in a sense, or at least for people to pioneer work that had the hindsight to understand how these earlier art historians might have been affected by their political circumstances. So particularly a scholar that's very prominent in this area is Ivan Folletti, who works at Masaryk University in Brno, and he's quite interested in historiography. He's published a work about this, which is very fascinating. So I think that historiography is very complex, and we have to sort of be careful that we can take a critical eye on it. Looking back at archives, for example, to give one instance, I was looking at the sort of conservation reports of my painting from 1940s, 1950s time, and you can see how. So there was one document that I found where it gave German instructions for the ways in which you should preserve these sorts of medieval painting. But then alongside that, they had letters between a German-speaking restorer who was living in the Czech Republic at that time. But then I found out eventually that she wasn't very well respected and eventually sort of exiled or caused to leave the country. Yeah, because the fact that she was German speaking after the war, in Czechoslovakia, they wouldn't want people like that there. But then the prominent professor of art history at the university in Brno at that time managed to get her back. And often people would use medieval art as a way of forming a national identity, whatever they perceived as a national identity. Was it a Czechoslovak national identity? Was it a Czech national identity? Recently, with the separation from Slovakia. So I think ultimately it's complex, and we have to be careful that we're aware of these nuances in our research. That's something I've become increasingly aware of. Yes.
Yeah, well, you've certainly brought a lot of nuance to this conversation. Let's go to recommendations. What is something you would recommend to our listeners?
Okay. Recently what I've been doing a lot more of, now that it's sort of almost becoming springtime, is I've been going out for walks a lot more, sort of as study breaks, and not even really listening to music, but just having time to just walk and reflect. Sometimes I pray as well, which is nice, but it's just a really great way for me to, I guess, distance myself from what I do and have that rest that I need. And at first I'd be thinking, oh, is that kind of boring? But actually I sort of gotten more and more used to it. So I would say that going for a walk, you can't really underestimate going for a walk, is what I've learned, especially in the stress of term.
So. I can imagine, yeah, that's definitely something that's great for relaxation. My recommendation to the listeners is, if you're interested in, I guess, there's an extent of religious allegory in there, the anime Neon Genesis Evangelion. I'm currently rewatching it. It's a really good show, so if you ever get bored, that's something that you might be able to check out. Alright, that brings us to the end of this episode. Isabel, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me. Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
I am Darius, the host. Our editor is Konstantina, and I bid you all farewell.